So in this section on carbohydrate digestion and absorption, we're going to talk about the steps of carbohydrate digestion. You're going to get a better understanding of what is meant by lactose intolerance, and you're going to learn about indigestible carbohydrates and their effect on the colon and feces. And then we're going to compare blood glucose levels after consuming simple carbohydrates versus complex carbohydrates. So in the process of carbohydrate digestion and absorption, enzymes break down starches and sugars into from polysaccharides into disaccharides and monosaccharides, which are then able to be absorbed and used for energy. Most of the fiber and other indigestible carbohydrates are excreted in the feces. And so this process, you can see here, begins in the mouth with the salivary glands. Salivary amylase starts breaking down starch into shorter polysaccharides. Then we move to the stomach, where salivary amylase is inactivated by acid. So no carbohydrate digestion actually occurs in the stomach. Then we move to the small intestine, and that's where the pancreas, right here, releases pancreatic amylase and completes the job of breaking down starch into disaccharides and oligosaccharides. And then the large intestine is really where fiber and other indigestible carbohydrates, fiber are partially broken down, but not by enzymatic action, but by bacterial degradation to form short-chain fatty acids and gas. And whatever undigested carbohydrates remain are excreted in the feces. Now, back up to step 4 over here. This is a view of the small intestine where the microvilli there complete the digestion of disaccharides and oligosaccharides into monosaccharides. And then pass that in through the vein to the liver. So let's talk about the small intestine enzymes. Maltase breaks down maltose into the 2 glucose molecules. Sucrase breaks down sucrose into 1 fructose and 1 glucose molecule. And this is where lactase breaks down lactose into 1 galactose and 1 glucose molecule. And at this point in the small intestine, all the polysaccharides have been broken down into single sugars called monosaccharides. So a lot of people have lactose intolerance. You might have it. Basically, what lactose intolerance is the inability to completely digest lactose due to a reduction in the levels of the enzyme lactase. So low levels of the small intestine enzyme lactase. Here it says, so the lactose can't be broken down into the small or form of monosaccharides. So this larger disaccharide passes into the large intestine where the bacteria get it and they digest it, and this causes symptoms of gas, abdominal distension, cramping, diarrhea. And for those people that are lactose intolerant, dairy is not well tolerated. And so they have a difficult time getting the calcium they need because in the United States, milk is the primary source of calcium. And many people who are lactose intolerant can handle small amounts of lactose, and therefore they can meet their calcium needs by consuming small portions of milk or other dairy products, eating cheese or yogurt, which contain less lactose than milk. But those who can't tolerate any lactose can get their calcium from non-dairy sources like tofu, some beans, dark green leafy vegetables, canned salmon and sardines. Why those? Because they have the bones of the salmon and the sardines in them. That's where the calcium comes from. As well as calcium fortified foods. Lots of orange juices now or have calcium fortification. I even saw Hershey's syrup has calcium in it. Calcium supplements or lactase treated milk where they put the lactase enzyme in it, such as lactate. Or another option is they can take the lactase tablets with or before consuming milk products, and that helps them digest the lactose before it passes into the large intestine. Now, sometimes people have a hereditary form of lactose intolerant. This map illustrates the variation in the incidence of lactose intolerance around the world. What we see is some ethnic and racial populations, like African Americans, can have up to an 80 to 100%. 80% of African Americans can be lactose intolerant. Native Americans have a higher rate from 80 to 100%, and Asian Americans from 90 to 100%, but only about 15% of Caucasian Americans are lactose intolerant. Now, this is a genetic lactose intolerant. Now, lactose intolerance can sometimes occur from disorders of the small intestine, sometimes from prolonged antibiotic use, from inflammation in the small intestine, or post surgeries to the small intestine. Those villi that contain the enzyme, the lactase enzyme, can be damaged, or it can be less available for temporary reasons. So sometimes it can improve over time if there are temporary or more acute issues of lactose intolerance. Let's talk about indigestible carbohydrates a little bit more. So we talked about some carbohydrates are not digested and therefore are not readily absorbed. So fiber and some oligosaccharides are not digested because they can't be broken down by human enzymes. So fiber, oligosaccharides, these are 3 to 10 sugar units that some are not broken down by human enzymes, and resistant starch are some natural structures of the grain that protects the starch molecule, and they may or may not be broken down in cooking or processing. So the digestibility is altered. Examples are some beans, unripe bananas, cold cooked potatoes, some types of rice and pasta can have resistant starches in them. Here's a great example. I said it earlier, we were going to talk about carbohydrates. The picture on the left is a graph, and what we want to talk about is how fiber promotes health by slowing digestion and absorption. So it reduces the transit time, or how quickly food leaves the stomach into the small intestine, and it can promote the growth of healthy microflora. And the picture on the right is a picture of bifidobacteria. That's some healthy bacteria in the small intestine. But let's talk about the picture on the left first. So what's shown here on the left is that this person has consumed a high fiber meal, and it dilutes the gastrointestinal contents in the stomach. And this dilution slows the digestion of food and absorption of nutrients. So those green dots that you see are moving slowly out of the intestine. This causes a delay or a blunting in the rise of blood glucose that occurs after a meal. But that might be, a meal that has fiber, a full meal on it. Now the low fiber meal on the right might be like a Coke or a very sugary soda, shown on the right there. And what happens in this meal, there's no fiber in it, so it's more concentrated. Digestion and absorption occur very rapidly, shown as the green dots moving quickly out of the intestine, and this causes a quicker or a sharper rise in blood glucose. So we can see that in the bottom, that blood glucose rises, dependent on how much fiber in the meal. So a low fiber meal causes a greater spike in blood sugar, and a high fiber meal causes a slower, more moderate blood glucose rise there. Now the picture on the right, so let's talk about those indigestible carbohydrates. They're a food source for bacteria in the colon. When the bacteria break down these carbohydrates, short-chain fatty acids are formed, and this acidic condition results in the inhibition of the growth of bad bacteria or undesirable bacteria in favor of the growth of healthy bacteria, such as the bifidobacteria shown here. And imbalances in these gut bacteria are related to numerous disorders, including colon cancer, inflammatory bowel disease, allergies, and even linked to diabetes. So this is a graph here that shows, it's a little bit more support of the evidence that in the 1970s, when they discovered, they compared Ugandan villagers who consumed a diet high in fiber with British subjects living in Uganda who consumed a more refined, low fiber diet. Remember we talked about this with the Egyptians earlier on. What we see here is stool weights are greater and their stomach transit times are shorter for those that consume a higher fiber diet, actually a healthier diet. So let's talk a little bit about glycemic index versus glycemic load and glycemic response. Now, I actually like to start out with glycemic response, and what that means, that's the rate or the magnitude or duration of the rise in blood glucose that occurs after a food is consumed. So it's really a measure of the impact a food has on blood glucose levels, or how quickly and how high blood glucose levels rise are affected by how long it takes the food to leave the stomach and how fast that food is digested and the glucose is absorbed. So what we do know is refined sugars and simple starches generally cause a greater glycemic response than more unrefined or complex carbohydrates, because these simple carbohydrates consumed alone leave the stomach quickly and are rapidly digested and absorbed. We talked a lot about blood glucose and fiber. So if you drink a soda, it increases with your blood glucose sharply rises within minutes. But if you eat fiber-containing foods such as oatmeal, it takes longer to leave your stomach and cause a lower glycemic response. And when we typically don't eat foods that are just one item, when we eat a meal that's carbohydrate, fat, and protein together, the stomach empties slower, it delays both digestion and absorption of carbohydrates, so blood glucose rises more slowly than when carbohydrate is consumed alone by itself. Chicken, brown rice, green beans, there's carbohydrate in there, fat and protein. The blood glucose doesn't begin to rise for 30 to 60 minutes. Now, glycemic index, how I like to explain this is it's basically, people use it as a ranking of how food affects blood glucose level relative to other foods. So it's a scale of 1 to 100. So white bread might have a glycemic index of 100, meaning it's a very simple carbohydrate. You eat it, your blood glucose level rises very quickly. It's a simple carbohydrate, whereas those lower on the glycemic index scale, like kidney beans here, are 25. A lot more fiber in that, more complex carbohydrate. It does not affect the blood glucose relative as quickly because it takes more to break it down because of the fiber in there. Glycemic load, that's typically referred to is how many grams of carbohydrate are consumed at a point. Nowadays, we don't really do diabetic diets. We used to teach diabetics to eat a certain kind of diet.